Everybody, true fact, Benita is pretty amazing. She's the director of the land grant office at Diné College, one of our 1994 institutions, and she's of the Diné people. She's Navajo, a member of the Navajo Nation. She's been working as a land grant director for the past 16 years, developing different Native American agricultural programs. She's been encouraging farmers to improve their existing farm or ranch operations through informal extension education and assisting them with a hands-on approach to implementing new techniques. Most importantly, working with other collaborators, she's been working to establish a Navajo food sovereignty policy that meets the needs of local growers. Additionally, working with producers on understanding their obligations as a food producer and meeting food safety guidelines. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce you to this presentation and to Land Grant Director Benita Litson.
Thank you, Lawrence Shorty. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Benita Litson, and I'll just introduce myself with my clans in Navajo. I am from Saili, so I am privileged to be working in my own hometown where Diné College is housed, the main campus. So thank you for inviting me to speak. And so I've been doing a lot of work with farmers and ranchers on Navajo, grew up, farming and ranching and understanding a lot of the internal barriers living on the reservation and access to many programs. And so we feel like, what's key is developing what we think would be a good food policy model. So just keep in mind that every reservation or every tribal community is very different in their governmental structure. So I'll be speaking specifically on the way the Navajo is sort of, governed, which is, like I said, a lot different from other tribes. Next slide, sorry. So why is it important to create food policy? One, of course, it supports our farmers and ranchers. We definitely are unique in the sense that most of us are on trust land, so it's really hard to borrow money against what we are trying to do. It's really hard to access programs, and so we're just in a different, unique situation. So we want to make sure that policy is also going to benefit our producers rather than creating a barrier. It also would help with the opportunity of increasing locally grown products and sales, in addition to having our people have access to that food system, locally grown. Many of our tribes have sustained themselves through hunting, gathering, and creating their own food systems, and that has been disrupted. And so we start relying on governmental aid, food distributions, different things like that. And so we become accustomed to a new way of eating our foods and lots of introduced foods. So definitely trying to increase access of locally grown foods and some of those traditional foods. And that's where I think it's going to be difficult to infuse a lot of what we call our traditional foods into a food policy. And that's where really trying to tweak languages, building that capacity of other folks who might oversee these policies would definitely, need to be there. And so it's going to be a work in progress with whatever tribe you're working with or institutions. Also, of course, new market opportunities. Most of Indian communities, we like to share our foods rather than sell our foods. So we share it with family, share it with other community members. And so we're not so accustomed to selling our foods to our neighbors. And so when we start thinking alongside those lines, it's very, very different for us individually. So it's something new, and it's something that I feel like we have to help train individuals. I am privileged to work with one of the elder in my community, and she says, treat everything like an ear of corn. use your hands and mark your hands across the corn cob. So one hand would be for yourself as your family to consume. The other hand covering would be to share with others. And the last one is to save it for the next year's crop. So that's, like sort of her rule of thumb in regards to how she saves her food, consumes her food, and also shares. So those are, good things to really think about when you're working with Indian communities. Also, traditional foods. What is traditional foods? For us, could be like, picking pinion, pine nuts right off the ground and making it into like a paste or salad, different things like that. You could also be foraging, looking for wild onions, wild parsley, those type of things. How do we start putting that back into our food system or our diets? Knowing that, we have to meet these food safety guidelines. So those are things that we really have to think about when we're talking about food security and food systems in Indian country. The other is to also protect our food source. So many of us, you all probably might not know, but I sat on the Soil and Water Conservation District when I first got back to Navajo, and it was really surprising that USDA Natural Resource Conservation Services didn't recognize dryland farming as agricultural practice. And so many of our seeds are heirloom seeds that are unique to our region and our area. And so if we were to, bring in GMO seeds and compromise our old heirloom seeds, that would be a devastation to many of our food sources. So that's, a huge part of, I think, protecting our traditional foods, let alone, someone maybe taking that and patenting that particular seed. So those are some of the things that many of our tribal communities are, afraid of seeing one of these days happen. So it's definitely something that needs to be discussed. Next slide. So some of the steps, rather than what we see, I think most of the time, are these policies being created as a, above, over the top, pushing down. So I think within our way of trying to create this policy is let's go listen to the grassroots level folks. Let's go hold these community meetings in the Hogan, in the community, with the fire lit, with the ash out, just like we do with discussion, with prayer, and then sharing foods from different families, and being able to gather, and what does food mean to us. And so we've done this for about 3 years, going out to many communities and talking about how we are going to create what they want to see in this policy. What are some of the barriers that they might already be having, and what are those challenges, so that we identify them and make sure that we're able to create some sort of headway in regards to making those barriers less, I guess, demanding, or harder to figure out how we can work through those different types of obstacles. So for us, I was so surprised when I invited a lot of folks that were doing work around food systems, training farmers and ranchers. We have 21 nonprofit organizations across the Navajo Nation doing similar work around food systems. And so bringing them all together so that we are all on one page, and understanding that we pretty much almost have one goal, is to create food security, train more farmers and ranchers, sustaining that way of life. And so how do we do this strategically? Because the Navajo Nation is large. It covers 3 states, multiple counties. And so there's a lot of other things that we have to think about. But the more of us out there being able to do this work cohesively and strategically definitely is important, so that we can start really pushing local governments throughout Navajo to recognize food sovereignty or food security or food policy as being important. And so I think that's one of the things that is going to be important with any tribal communities, is gathering those grassroots level folks and the people that are going to help you do that work across your nation. Other areas are, start inviting folks within your governmental structure so that they understand that you are talking about food systems, food structures, so that they can help be that advocacy at your council or within your, like I said, governmental structure, to be able to help you determine who you need to talk to best, what departments that you might have to be involved with in creating these food policy or these structures. So there's definitely a lot of working parts to trying to create a food policy in Indian country. And so most of it is simultaneously. You have groups that are still conducting grassroots level information gathering, and then you have folks sitting down with your president or different council members sharing information about what food policy means to this group. So that's definitely, I think, going to continue. We have been working on this, I want to say, more than 5 years, so it's still in the works. And we're hoping that these policies will start becoming shaped stronger. And one thing that we're afraid of is that we want to make sure it's grassroots driven rather than some political person bringing grabbing a hold of it and being able to push that as a part of their agenda too quick. And so that's kind of what we are afraid of. But for me as a land grant institution, is trying to help these folks be able to gather, share information, and help transcribe, do the best we could to really support this initiative. Next slide. So like I said, we've gone to chapter houses. So what you see here are groups of folks that we invite. We talk about anything from water quality. We have a few irrigated lands on Navajo. Most of it is in northern Navajo, which is along the San Juan River. Other areas are small irrigated pastures or farmland developed by earthen dams or lakes that were developed in the 40s. And so a lot of these structures are deteriorating, and so there's a lot of planning that definitely needs to happen to create the infrastructure to ensure that we continue to grow our foods, in addition to being able to share that with the next generation. Next slide. So this here is a first part of what we put together on our food policy. So basically, we're saying that food sovereignty to us is the fundamental to rebuilding a healthy and self-sufficient food system for the Dene people. Dene food sovereignty is the right to Dene people to define their own policies and strategies for sustainable production, distribution, and consumption of food with respect to Dene culture, philosophy, and value, and is considered to be a precaution for food security on the Dene Nation. So Dene food sovereignty ensures the ability to establish our own culturally appropriate and sustainable systems of managing and protecting natural resources, including land, territories, water, seed, livestock, and biodiversity. Dene food sovereignty empowers Dene people by putting the Dene people, farmers, and livestock owners at the center of decision-making of policy, strategies, and natural resource management. And so we feel like these are this is the core language that we feel that should drive this policy moving forward, is that we want to make sure that our farmers and ranchers are at the center of being able to make some decisions to ensure that food is available to our communities, in addition to the understanding that some of these barriers need to be removed. Next slide. So when I was mentioning a section of the paragraph, culturally appropriate or sustainable system of managing and protecting natural resource, including lands, territories, waters, seed, livestock, and biodiversity. Pretty much, the bullets below is what we intend to do in regards to trying to, work on these particular policies. We definitely need to engage the next generation, the next generation of farmers, to understand that our food system and food security is important. On Navajo, in the community that I am in, we have 133 farm plots, and we only had 9 active farmers. And so trying to revitalize agriculture in some of these communities is definitely a challenge. So, since we have been involved with this project, we have grown up to 24 farmers. So, and all of this is trying to support one another, understanding why it's difficult to farm, and many of it is on tribal lands is the permit structure for land transfer. It's definitely different and challenging, I'm sure, for other tribes too. So many elders still hold the permit and they're not able to farm. And so if they were going to transfer it to one of their family members, it could take years to do so. And so that's where, we're challenged. These farm plots, like I said, we could have co-ops or associations. This particular group was trying to access USDA NRCS dollars to do some infrastructure improvement. However, because all of the farmers are not, how would you say, the permits have not been transferred to another, there's not an actual owner to certain farmland. So it creates a barrier to access USDA programs because of that control of the land issue. And that one person in the middle of the farmland might say no or might not have a permit, however, could hinder the development of the main irrigation system. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but things like those type of barriers are definitely a challenge for us. But being able to understand it, being able to help USDA programs understand our challenges is also important, along with our own Navajo Nation Department of Agriculture or different departments to start working together and create opportunity and figure out how to work through these barriers. Other ways are accountability of people in charge, just meaning, when the policy is in place, who's going to do the oversight? Are we going to have an audit, a food auditor that not only, is accustomed to making sure that we meet FSMA goals, but what is our fundamental law, food safety? We're talking about like how we make steamed corn. Most of us, we put it into the earth, we fire the ground, dig a pit, put a fire in there, and it reaches a really, really hot temperature. Then you put in your corn and you let it steam overnight. And so that's the traditional way of doing things. So how can we put science to that and say that that process is safe because we've reached a certain temperature and we are able to do this in a certain way? And so how can we indicate or create I don't want to, maybe like a protocol around saying traditional steamed corn is safe because of these X, Y, and Z parameters that we have created, and adding those type of things to our food safety guidelines for our traditional food systems. So that's one example. Another, we have communities who still consume wild rabbit, prairie dog, those type of things within their food system. But how do you say that you want rabbit on the meal, in the meals of your schools, for lunch, those type of things? So how do we start making that discussion happen or make that happen? There's some tribes where they have added bison meat back into their diet, going through schools and senior centers. And that's because they're raising it, getting it butchered at a USDA certified facility and bringing that back into the school system. So what would that look like for other animals, for, for different tribes? So that's another example. And then of course, making sure that our people have a voice, empowering our people to um, be able to recognize these barriers and understand them and figure out ways to, I guess, mitigate or work with the proper departments to make sure that we have access to these programs. And then always involving, people that want to educate, whether it's going to be traditional teaching or informal teaching, like what we do about soils, how to grow new crop. For many folks, I think non-Native American, when we talk about traditional crops, it's probably like lettuce, spinach, those type of things. However, in Indian country, our traditional crops are definitely different. So really understanding what traditional crops means to specific tribal communities is going to be important. And then just like, I think water is one of the biggest issue right now. We're all in a drought. We're all trying to protect and conserve the amount of water we use. And so that, I think that's one of the overlining umbrella that makes agriculture work, is having the people really understand what watershed management is, and starting to create plans and work together to develop watershed plans to help not only, the current situation that we might be in, but to allow agriculture to continue for future generations. Next slide. So, so many of our foods, we say is a gift from, the higher being, or for us, we call it the Indana. And that provides food sustenance. So, we see corn as corn, but it is prepared in multiple ways. And so in ceremonies, they're prepared specifically for that ceremony in a certain way. And so if you listen to songs and prayers of a lot of Indian people, it's really aligned with how conservation is being taught on the Western education side. Just using a certain plant and identifying the stages of its life and understanding what that means to the people and how it can be consumed. There's so much meaning to it. And so making sure that our foods are still going to be a part of our people for the next, generation or 7 generations ahead. And I think that's where this policy is very, very important, is that we're able to understand what those foods are and be able to share it with the next generation so that they all understand those same songs and prayers that is consumed with, the right types of foods within that setting. And another one is another example that might push the FSMA boundary is, we all have milk in the, at lunchtime when you're in school, and a lot of us are lactose intolerant. And so many of our people, we use the juniper ash as a, high calcium, nutritious supplement. And so how can we get juniper ash into our diets, like, adding it like salt or, different sugars or different things like that, but adding that as an additive, or maybe like, what are they called? A lot of those little small powdery supplements. How do we create that for our people and to make sure that our kids are, consuming it either for breakfast or lunch, but it's a part of our diet. So that's another example. So The others are rainwater harvesting. Um, we understand and we have heard, you know, there's a lot of new restrictions that are pushed down upon rain harvesting, how it could be used in growing your foods. So how do we, what kinds of things do we need to do to ensure that we are not compromising being able to harvest rain and use that as our irrigation system, and understanding that. So that's something that we feel that's huge. Next slide. So aside from water, I think the next challenge is really understanding food safety. And so, and that's abiding by the Food Safety Modernization Act protocols or guidelines. Within our own traditional stories, there's a lot of you can't do certain things within your farmland. And when you read this, you know, the Navajo teaching of what you can and cannot do within your farmland, because, you know, of I don't want to say taboo, but it's really a story, because they say your food is, you know, just like we say, food is our medicine. It's what we eat. It's who we are. So you don't disrespect where you're growing your food. You don't tamper with it. You don't, you know, things like that. And so when you read the FSMA guidelines, it's very similar. And so how do we educate, you know, FSMA in a way that it's still a part of how we culturally teach food safety? Because it's very much in line. I think some of the things that the struggling part is putting it on paper, documenting it on paper, you know, who's going to be in the field at certain times, changing our shoes to make sure that we didn't use the same shoe to feed our animals into the garden where we're harvesting, making sure we wash our hands, you know, taking temperature, you're not sick while you're harvesting, those type of things. Now, how do we record that, document that, and make sure that we're able to put that into a document that's legible or readable for maybe an auditor to come out, or for traceability if anything ever happened, that they're able to trace back to your farmland. And that's where I think we are challenged. I know we're working with New Mexico State University, thinking about how we can improve that particular process of helping our farmers and ranchers do better record keeping, and we're hoping that we're able to create some new modules that are language appropriate for our farmers and ranchers in the future. The other, I feel like most Indian country, we are not infrastructurally there to support food safety. When we're talking about, like I was talking about earlier, making steamed corn or nashjiji, you know, when we're having value added products, we need a commercial kitchen, a certified commercial kitchen. On Navajo, I do not know of one certified commercial kitchen that's open to the community to use. And so how do we fix that? You know, to say that we want food sovereignty to happen, but infrastructurally, you know, we're not prepared to be able to assist our farmers and ranchers to make sure they're meeting those food safety guidelines or food safety protocols. We just finally at Dene College finally put up a walk-in refrigerator unit over the summer, because we're doing these food distributions due to the COVID pandemic, but we needed place to store the produce that was coming in, and being able to get it, you know, 130 food packages ready and out the door within 3 days, and make sure that it's at the right temperature. And so, you know, that those are things, you know, it seems like it's easy to do, but we got to think about where it's going to be housed. Is the community going to be able to access that particular building or that particular refrigeration unit. Um, how much access can they have? And then how are we going to distribute the food that's being processed or developed or harvested? So there's, I feel like once we get farmers trained and understanding food safety, we still need to have the infrastructure support to help the farmers be able to store their food longer, to be able to get it to a school or a senior center. So definitely that's something that's important. And when we talk about infrastructure on Navajo or anywhere, I think in Indian country, it is going to take a long time because you have to find land. You have to go through all the governmental channels to get approval. You have to go through governmental approval for that little space that you're going to build, and then funding. By the time you secure funding, sometimes funding's only there for 3-4 years, and you still haven't get approval to build your site. And so those are real challenges in Indian country. Is the different dynamic of the trust land issue, that because that land is not really belonging to the people, we still have to go through various approval processes to be able to um, designate a land or a space for a particular building. So that's a challenge, and that's why we don't see a lot of progress in Indian countries, just because of how difficult it is to find land to build on. Next slide. So, like I said, we've been training farmers and ranchers, taking them from their farmland out to grocery stores. What are the types of foods that the grocery stores want, and what does the farmers need to do to be able to prepare their foods for grocery, stores? And one of the big, I think, barriers between that is the distribution site. There definitely has to be some sort of distribution center that could house the amount of food that a grocery store might want or need. And so lots of training continuously has to happen between the growers and the consumer, in addition to the people that are buying and selling the product. Next slide. So here we've been hosting farmers markets throughout the Navajo Nation, basically trying to teach the farmers how to start marketing the product that they grow. And so we have anywhere from old orchards of peach, pears, and apple trees. I mean, these are 100-year-old trees, and they're still producing fruit. And so, there's a lot of different types of foods that we can definitely introduce into our food system. Now is just figuring out how do we do that, and then training our farmers to start thinking that we can be a part of having healthier foods in our communities, in addition to being able to possibly get a little bit more money off of what we're doing. And so, of course, continue training. Next slide. I think I'm almost done. So one of the things we do at Diné College is we train at least 90 farmers every summer in agriculture. And so we host 3 different youth camps for ages from 7 to 17 years old. They learn how to plant, they learn how to identify seeds, they learn how to butcher, they participate in butchering, they learn how to work cattle, sheep, just pretty much the whole 9 yards of what you can slum in 2 weeks for agricultural experience. One of the most important thing is we have them work with an elder, and we take him to either Durango or Mancos and off reservation, and we look at some of the small farms that might be growing 1/3 of an acre of onions and selling it to a restaurant and still getting $20,000 for that. And then you sit back down with the student and say, we have the same opportunity too. We can do this. We're not that far from Farmington or Durango. There's other restaurants in the border towns that you guys could sell to. And we start thinking about different opportunities that they could have in agriculture. And I think that's the best setting, is that students start to see that there's more out there than just, you know, what they have been doing, helping grandma and grandpa around the house. But there's definitely um, like a light at the end of the tunnel when you're working on in agriculture. Next slide. So already talked about this quite a bit. The infrastructure is definitely important to assist farmers and ranchers, also consumers and distribution. Next slide. So at Dene College, since I've been there for 16 years, and I really would love to help with that type of developing the infrastructure that would help farmers and ranchers. So one of my initiatives is working on developing a Shiprock Business Center for Horticulture on tribal agriculture. And this is the sort of like the map that I envision. The main thing in the blue right there in the middle would be a certified kitchen along with a multi-purpose center where we could do, you know, ag education, food safety education, different types of workshops. And then we have multiple hoop houses. We also would have little small, you know, not necessarily dorms, but little areas that where people or researchers can come in and stay because there's no hotel in Shiprock, but be able to work with us throughout the summer and develop new programs and opportunity. And so, you know, that's something we're working on right now. We're developing the architectural design for this building. And so we're excited about this, and we're hoping to get some funding to make this happen. Next slide. We also developed an agriculture degree program at Dene College. We do have 7 students. I am actually here at New Mexico State University today, and I will be having lunch with 2 of my former student interns who transferred to New Mexico State University for agriculture degree program. So, you know, there's a lot of interest in agriculture discipline. And so what do we need to do at Dene College to help train the next generation, to help run those facilities, to help ensure that food safety is happening in our communities? And so we're hoping to do that by developing this program. Next slide. So we are pretty much at the end. These are just photos that I have shared of some of the work that we are doing. Like I said, most of our traditional farming would be on the top left side outside in the field. We have introduced the hoop house system and having folks grow in the hoop house, extending their seasonal growing system, doing raised beds because we have a prairie dog problem. I mean, you know, different alternative ways of trying to get you know, new foods into the community. So it's definitely been fun. And you know, we with this group we had 7 elderly, all above 60 years old, just growing food and loving it. And so, and that's what we're seeing is a lot of the retired folks coming back and you know, learning how to either refarm or taking over their parents' old farmstead. Next slide, and I believe that's it. So we're done. And that's a lot to cover. And this is a topic that could take all day. I mean, when we're in our groups, we probably would sit here for a day and a half. So thank you for listening.